In a recent interview on the BBC, I recently heard an ICE agent say that if we didn't deport 2,000 people in raids in July, then there would be no reason to comply with the rules of law, and if that happened, law and order would break down and America would be thrown into chaos. If 11 million undocumented immigrants is so terrible, why and how did it get this bad? What caused our lawmakers to turn a blind eye to all the immigrants from our southern border from coming here and staying for decades? Law and order could break down. Well, it really comes down to money and punishment level. In 1965, crossing the border became a Class B misdemeanor for the first time in our nation's history. Prior to that, the idea of even trying to protect the long, rough terrain of the border was ludicrous. During World War II, America had a labor shortage, with so many troops off at war, and we created the Bracero program that enticed Mexican workers to come to America and do agricultural work. However, after the war and during the 1950s, there was a job shortage, and we created a program literally called Operation Wetback to forcefully remove these braceros from America if they didn't leave on their own. We also started patrolling the border to ensure they wouldn't come back. However, when the border was unguarded, they would come and go freely because they always knew they could come back. Once the border closed, many started to come in and stay because they knew they couldn't come back once they got here. The Mexican border had never ever been about safety and security. It was all about jobs for white people specifically. This was the time of Jim Crow. Of course it was about racism. We had also deported and stripped up to 2 million U.S. citizens of their citizenship and sent them to Mexico during the Great Depression and pushed native peoples into Mexican territory after the Mexican-American War, so in all likelihood many of these people coming here illegally actually have some legitimate claim to be here as citizens. While it's a Class B misdemeanor to cross the border illegally for the first time, interstate and border enforcement is a federal government job, and state and local cops had other things to worry about than enforce a federal law, but used it mostly on people who broke other laws. The federal government did have immigration police, but compared to the people coming into our nation versus getting deported, it was a drop in the bucket. And why? Here's the top 10 reasons why we don't mass deport people. Number 10, immigrants, legal and illegal, are walking piggy banks to politicians. Unlike legal citizens, immigrants, both documented and undocumented, get no federal benefits. No Social Security, no healthcare, no welfare, no food stamps. That's around 55% of our national budget. They take nothing from it, but still pay all their taxes. It's like we are stealing from them, not the other way around. They can't vote, so politicians don't have to listen to their demands at all. They don't have to toss money toward their neighborhoods, and don't have to keep them happy. They are also useful to use as scapegoats, but never actually do much about. There are states that give benefits, but it's the federal government that enforces the immigration law. If you don't like your taxes going to immigrants, take that up with your state, not the federal government. Number 9, cost-benefit analysis. People think systems like welfare are being cheated all the time, but most nonpartisan experts put benefit cheating at around 3%. Which may sound like a lot, but as efficiency of any company or system goes, that is insanely good. And it is Americans who are most likely to cheat the system, not immigrants. They could hire more people to enforce and ensure people cheat even less, but then you're spending more on enforcement, which, after a certain percentage of efficiency, ends up losing the taxpayers more money than just putting up with these inefficiencies in the system. Determining this is called a cost-benefit analysis, and it's more often a lower-income person, and giving money to a poor middle-class person generates more wealth and jobs than when it goes to a rich person because they spend it immediately. So being happy with a 3% inefficiency rate is a mathematical no-brainer. Courts and pressing charges is much more expensive than just letting that tiny amount of money be cheated. The same thing is true for dealing with immigrants. All immigrants pay taxes, but get none of the benefits of being taxed if they aren't citizens. Unlike with weighing the balance between more efficient versus more corruption, not enforcing immigration policies other than for convicted criminals isn't just an equal math equation like with enforcing welfare cheats versus not paying people to enforce it. This is an extremely good way to make money off of people who will never take benefits. These people are free money for the federal government, so they essentially put on a show of doing the occasional raid, but put much more effort into deporting criminals. And before you get deported, you get a trial. That also costs the government money because you could actually be an American citizen and you have the right to prove you aren't here illegally. That costs money to run courts. It costs money to house and imprison people and guard them. Enforcing most immigration policy is a tax suck. By enforcing federal immigration policy, your tax money is being wasted on a daily basis, and lawmakers know that. That's why St. Reagan was for amnesty and a path to citizenship. The government was inching their way slowly to comprehensive immigration reform. But, number 8, they make great scapegoats for demagogues. In the 1990s, Pat Buchanan, a not-so-secret fascist and white supremacist, and if you don't believe me, please listen to Behind the Bastards podcast listed below, and he has all his sources in his show notes, who list Francisco Franco as one of his heroes, began framing this issue in these people breaking a sacred law, and if we don't enforce them, then chaos and disorder would reign, and the immigrants would take our jobs. They also like to spread the BS notion that these are dirty, diseased people, even though Central America vaccinates their kids on a higher rate than kids in the US. Entirely getting rid of this group to blame everything on is bad for political business. Number 7, laws are there to protect people from each other, not just to be enforced. The idea that law and order would break down if we didn't enforce this specific law is a complete joke. Cops and prosecutors don't have to go out of their way to protect you as a citizen or press charges against people if they don't feel like it. If that were true, whites and non-poor would be charged in drug use at a slightly higher rate than poor and black people, but they often don't bother and drop the case because the non-poor can hire lawyers to work exclusively for them, and that'll make the court fight a pain in the rear. Laws by right are there as a protection of people from one another, not a sacred thing standing between us and pure chaos and violence. Otherwise, every single pollution violation would be punished to the full extent of the law, when really they just get a pass due to low funding for inspectors, so the frequency of their inspections are much lower than they should be. If an immigrant isn't directly harming you, there's no incentive to enforce a law on them when there are worse law breaking to enforce. That requires more resources that could be spent protecting us from dire threats, diverted to this one issue most politicians don't care about because it makes budgeting easier. Number 6, laws are often tools and not required to be enforced. Think of all the laws on the books in America. You can look up all the silly laws that are never enforced anymore that a cop could legally bust you for. Why are they there? Mostly to give cops and prosecutors more tools to bust really bad people, or in more overtly racist areas, to keep minorities on their toes. Al Capone couldn't be brought down for murder, so they hit him with tax evasion. Also, laws often written disagree with other laws, which is why certain laws are only enforced under certain situations. Overstaying your visa, which makes up about 65% of new undocumented migrants, is just a civil violation, the same as a traffic violation. Cops and prosecutors have the discretion not to enforce certain laws, but can use these laws to add to a sentence, even if the evidence for what they are initially trying to charge the person is weak. Otherwise, you'd never be let off with a warning for speeding. You would always get a ticket, or law and order would break down, and there would be mass murders, and people would know that there's no consequences. Number 5, undocumented immigrants require little policing. Politicians like to push the idea that all or the majority of undocumented immigrants are crime-ridden and all a part of MS-13, and some, I sure, are good people. That couldn't be further from the truth. For one thing, MS-13 was created in California by second-generation immigrants from El Salvador after we helped topple their government in a violent coup. First-generation immigrants, both documented and undocumented, commit half the crimes that American citizens do. Why wouldn't they? They worked their asses off to get here, and they don't want to mess up that sweet deal. They keep their heads down and try not to be noticed by cops. The threat of deportation is a bigger tool to keep them in line than actually following through, and there are several very real reasons why sanctuary cities exist. It's mostly a way to protect cops and citizens. If immigrant populations can't trust the cops not to deport them or family members, they won't report crimes or talk to the cops. This is dangerous to all cops and citizens, as catching the actual criminals are hard enough, especially if they're related to mob or gang activity. Plus, it's the sovereign right of the state not to be forced to spend their money and resources to enforce federal law. It's funny how states want states' rights about not enforcing Klan and white supremacist federal laws, but they say you're helping criminals if your city or state doesn't want to spend your taxpayers' hard-earned money helping ICE destroy all trust immigrants may have of their city and state police, and dump them into a pig pen waiting for a trial that could take months to process and prove they are here illegally. Number 4, it's better to bust the employers than do a mass deportation. One of the big claims is that immigrant labor depresses wages and steals jobs. In some sectors, there is truth to this, such as landscaping and construction. However, this usually only happens on a job shortage period. During a labor shortage, workers in all low-skilled fields become difficult to come by. American citizens get picky and choosy about the qualities and difficulty of work they want to do. So immigrants of all types, especially in agriculture areas, become viewed as essential if they don't want their crops to rot in the field. During a recession, employers will often illegally hire undocumented immigrants to not have to pay as much. Immigrants don't depress wages. Companies with all their hiring power use immigrants to cut costs and give themselves an unfair advantage in the marketplace. If there are no jobs, there's no reason to be here illegally. And we can get fines out of the companies that made money off of undercutting workers' pay and depressing wages, instead of net loss from going after immigrants themselves. Also, jobs like being an underpaid nanny or housekeeper are hired mostly by wealthier people, including Trump at Mar-a-Lago. Busting them would also get the government more money than punishing the workers with no money or power, but that would be burdensome regulation, right? Number 3, they do the jobs Americans don't want to do. For the jobs that pay like crap and were incredibly hard and no one could make an American standard of living on in the States, Mexicans can have that in Mexico and support their families by working in America just due to exchange rates. Most American citizens who go out in the fields to work quit within a week because it's brutal and grueling and they can find better work that pays by the hour and not by the weight picked. If we subsidize fruits and vegetables the way we subsidize grains, perhaps the jobs would pay better. But until then, fruits and veggies we all should eat more of are either more expensive or paid for by illegal immigrants. That said, no one is talking about the fact that Asians are actually the highest level of illegal immigrants, often overstaying their visas, and they actually do take jobs Americans want to do. And few realize that Europeans are often here undocumented because they don't fit the stereotype at all. Number 2, it's a logistics nightmare. As stated before, to be deported, you have a right to trial, in case you're actually a citizen or here legally. Before we started getting tough on immigrants, immigration courts were slow but fair to process and extradite people who are criminals and here illegally. Then we started ramping up deportation, but Congress was so deadlocked thanks to people like Mitch McConnell that the immigration courts didn't get more funding to match the rate of deportation orders. They just increased funding for border security and ICE. Without more courts, the backlog has been horrendous, and judges are punished for taking time to fully hear a case and make an informed decision. They can spend around 10 minutes on one case, and the charge can get maybe 10 minutes of legal counsel as well. Children have been forced to represent themselves. Mentally disabled American citizens, including an autistic African American, have been deported because they couldn't defend themselves, and there wasn't time to look into whether he was unable to speak clearly because he couldn't speak English or had some disability. Add to that interpreters are often not available or also underfunded, so they don't get fair representation that way. And housing them in these prison facilities, waiting weeks to months for an unfair trial, cost the government $133 per day while they sleep on the ground with or without aluminum blankets or soap because they have to pay for prison-like conditions with guards and guns to ensure they don't escape. That's $4,000 a month, almost $50,000 a year, which is a little under the average that Americans make in general. Letting them go free until their court hearing, even if they miss their court date, quite often due to underfunded courts unable to get the information about the trial date scheduled and take care of themselves, would save the taxpayers so much more money. No one who is a fiscal conservative and knows anything about law enforcement would think this is an acceptable way to deal with American tax dollars unless it wasn't about protecting American jobs or citizens at all and just a way to exploit American fear and anger, which should be directed at companies and not fellow workers, and give lucrative contracts to the prison industrial complex. And number 1, it's inhumane and unjust. In America, you're presumed innocent until proven guilty, as the founders would rather have 10 criminals go free than an innocent person be punished unfairly. And in mass deportations, American citizens always get swept up in the raids. Operation Wetback saw not only Mexican citizens deported, but also Latino Americans and Native Americans kicked out of the nation, dumped into the country that they had no ties to whatsoever, and all their possessions back on the other side, often with their families split apart and unable to see them again. That is why we treat all immigrants even undocumented ones, like they're allegedly here legally, and not immediately assume they're criminals, which I must repeat is just a Class B misdemeanor, which has at most a sentence of 6 months in prison, or Class E felony if you have been deported and cross again, which is a max of 2 years in prison. Using Smokey Bear's likeness, using high-level fireworks, illegally trespassing on national forests, smoking weed, and mailing dentures in the mail are all considered worse crimes than first-time border crossers, yet you don't see a bunch of stoners and denture mailers locked up in a concentration camp without soap and bedding. The concentration camps we hold and separating kids from their parents are considered cruel and unusual punishment, which supersedes all other laws as it's in the Constitution. People use the argument that due process only applies to American citizens, but what if you actually are an American citizen and they use the policy waiting for your hearing? Due process is essential to determining citizenship, asylum, or legal status. We spent so much money on ICE to appear tough on illegal immigration, a Class B misdemeanor, but failed to equally boost the number of judges, lawyers, and interpreters so we could quickly and easily determine if we are also catching people here legally in these raids and wouldn't have to lock them up. Because of this now, Trump is using the backlogs in the asylum and immigration courts to tell legal asylum seekers they cannot come in because they just can't process any more people. Hell, ankle bracelets are the best way to ensure that asylum seekers show up for their court date instead of locking them up. Let them into the country. As they wait for a court date for their asylum trial, let them take care of themselves and put an ankle bracelet on them. Asylum seekers would be more than happy to comply with this if it meant escaping from persecution. Just as a year in high security prison is roughly the same price as a year in Harvard, we waste so much money on our primitive, petty view of revenge, we have ignored not only justice, but just how much our demand for punishment is stealing from our taxes we pay every day. It's one of the many reasons why Europe has 1/10 the prison population we do. We really are a fiscally stupid nation, preferring our tax money goes to war and punishment as opposed to things much more cheaply to prevent war, like foreign aid and trade deals, and things that prevent crime, like education and a social safety net, that people don't earn, but is still a fraction of how much it costs to punish people. Why haven't we rounded up and mass deported the 11 million people undocumented in the US? Because it's fiscally, legally, and morally dumb. It's just plain stupid, but it makes you feel righteously angry. So we have asylum-seeking people locked away in cages and people fearing that any day they could be separated from their families and their lives utterly destroyed because we are so petty we believe that their living here will cause the breakdown of all society and chaos will reign supreme. A big thank you goes out to Elias Garcia Guevara and Joe Taylor, who sponsor the show at $10 a month at the Wapawet level on Patreon. Please consider donating as well if you can, and thank you all for listening.